Welcome, everyone, for our first edition for the Institute of Liberal Values Book Club. Today, we're going to be discussing Empowered Humanity Theory by Jason Littlefield. And we have Xander Keeg, Wink Twyman, and myself, Diana Blum. And I thought we would start by having each of us give a brief background on how we came across empowered humanity theory and Jason's work. I'll just dive in. As a neurologist who focuses on the chronic management of Parkinson's disease, I found myself about a decade ago researching non pharmacological therapies that could help my patients live a better quality life. I studied neuroplasticity and how the brain can heal. I explored the benefits of daily gratitude and self compassion practices on nervous system regulation to help my patients live well despite a neurodegenerative disorder that wants to disconnect the brain from the body. Recognizing the merits of this work, I was thrilled to hear that schools began adopting similar concepts into a new framework called social emotional learning. Kids were going to be taught to spot big feelings so that they can pause, reflect, and choose their response instead of automatically reacting to their emotions. What could be better for a developing brain than practicing emotional regulation? So I thought. But during the pandemic, when school came home and I saw how this work was being implemented in my own kid's classroom, I became very alarmed. Children's emotions were being manipulated to drive behaviors in ways that I believed harmed the developing brain. So I felt compelled to learn more and do something about it. And that was about the time that I was fortunate enough to meet Jason, the author of today's book, who we will be meeting on episode 4. Um, he is a teacher and social emotional learning specialist himself, who also observed a shift in his field from the empowerment framework we both championed to a transformative model, one in which focused on addressing past societal ills with no regard to the unintended harm of the individual child today. Empowered humanity theory was developed to mitigate this destructive mindset, which quickly swept our nation, I'd say shortly after the death of George Floyd, when society experienced what neuroscientists would consider a limbic hijack. This occurs when our brain's emotional centers overwhelm the thinking brain, triggering a flood of fear, anger, anxiety, which really short circuits rational thought. People's sympathetic nervous system became stuck in overdrive. And I believe we've been living in this reactive state ever since. Those excusing violence as a means of justice have flipped their lids, and we'll talk about what that means. And that's really where the prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking brain, is nowhere to be found. And it's our primitive reactive brain that sadly is running the show now. We haven't had a chance to heal or process all of what has been happening because it seems like it's in the interest of the status quo to keep our amygdalas chronically stimulated and us perpetually divided. Humanity always suffers when humans double down on othering. This is why empowered humanity theory framework is critical in this moment in history. In the midst of our collective emotional turmoil, EHT teaches how we can better relate to ourselves and to others. Through the value centered identity, it builds a sense of self rooted in deeply held values rather than external validation or imposed labels, providing emotional stability and purpose. The dignity lens honors the inherent worth of each of us, creating the foundation of authentic connections, and the compassionate, inquisitive mindset embraces uncertainty and difference with curiosity and care instead of fear and judgment, opening the door to empathy and actual learning. These attitudes are not abstract ideals. Neuroscience reveals that they engage neuroplastic mechanisms that strengthen emotional regulation, empathy, and resilience, qualities essential for healing and growth. In my clinical work, I witness how cultivating these attitudes helps individuals emerge from emotional overwhelm to regain clarity, agency, and connection. So, empowered humanity theory offers a path for society as well to move beyond reactive polarization and towards thoughtful, compassionate engagement. Our emotions are powerful signals, but when they hijack our thinking, they leave us vulnerable to manipulation and division. Empowered humanity theory guides us in reclaiming our thinking brains, processing emotions fully, and building a future grounded in dignity and shared humanity. I can't wait to explore some of the concepts in this book with you all. Who wants to go next?
I think I'll step to the plate. Diana, thank you for those words. I mean, that was a nice overview of the intellectual feast ahead of us. I enjoyed Jason Littlefield's book immensely. And having said that, I'll provide some backstory as to why the framework, empowered humanity theory, so resonates with me. So I was born in Richmond, Virginia, of all places, back in 1961. And that's particularly interesting because, as people may know, Richmond, Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy. And the Confederacy was not known for their equal opportunity policies when it came to Black Americans, shall we say. So it was interesting to be born as a Black American in such a city. However, it was also the case that in my earliest years, I grew up in a southern suburb on a street called Twyman Road, which is my last name, and everyone was family. And I attended an all Black school. So for my entire life until the age of seven, second grade, my known world, my known universe was all Black. But I wasn't aware of race. Race didn't really matter to me because no one caused it to matter to me. No one imposed racial identity on me at that young age. Now, of course, when schools desegregated, that was a different story. And I became of race and racial identity. But even then, I saw it more as something other people place undue emphasis on, even at the tender age of 8 years old. We would move eventually further into the suburbs. And I learned to see people as individuals because when I would wake up in the morning in my all Black neighborhood, I would board the school bus and go to my newly desegregated public schools. My junior high was 3% Black, my high school was 8% Black. And I became very much of a student leader. I didn't become a leader because I doubled down on my tribal identity or my ethnic identity. What made a difference was always looking to see what did I share in common with my classmates, with my fellow students. And that became something that became a very deep part of how I navigated in the larger world. And so by the time I went on to university and law school, it was just second nature that you couldn't tell a person by their appearance or skin color. You really needed to know that inner person. What were their values? What were their attitudes? And to me, that was a way of showing dignity to people, which is part of Jason's framework. And also, I was always so curious about the larger world. I was never one content just to only know what I knew. I wanted to know those things I did not know with great intensity. And it's also interesting that that accords with the third prong of Jason's framework, the compassionate, inquisitive mindset, which is just another word for curiosity. But in any event, over time, I would become aware of Jason's framework in his book. How so, you may ask? Well, in some ways, it was because of you, Diana. In fact, I researched my emails. On August 24th, 2023, you reached out to me and said, wait, you should read this book. Look at these videos. This is wonderful framework. And I did. And I was captivated. Um, And the question's raised, well, how did Diana know to reach out to me? I had been struck in the year 2019, before George Floyd, by two things. One, I had someone close to me who declared one day, Blackness is oppression, nothing else matters. And that essentialism went so against everything I had learned over my half century of living. Even I, having been born in the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia, could see there was more to life than just oppression when it came to Blackness. And then number two, I happened to be a graduate of Harvard Law School. And it amazed me when I was denied a platform to talk about race and Blackness with a classmate because, and I quote, I might deviate from dogma. My head turned like the lady in the Exorcist movie. That's the point of education, higher education, and freedom of thought and inquiry and curiosity is to learn about different viewpoints and perspectives. So for those two reasons, I reached out to Jennifer Richmond, who we both know. She's with the Institute for Liberal Values. And we began writing a book, a correspondence about race across the color lines. The book is Letters in Black and White. And I think through that, you grew to know Jennifer and me. So, to sum up, I'm eager to discuss Jason's book because it so aligns with my way of navigating the world over half a century. I mean, I really think for myself, I view life as levers. There are things you avoid, and there are things you embrace and center for a good life. The things you avoid are dogmas and slogan words because they ignore the messiness of life. The things you embrace are human dignity, creative expression, and the individual. And as I navigate my life with those two levers, things to avoid, things to embrace, I find that I end up being a kind of a happier person. I find myself feeling more peace at the center. And I think that's the promise of Jason's framework, which we will dive into over the coming weeks. Thank you, Diana, for this opportunity.
Hey, well, thank you so much to both of you, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm pleased that I was invited to be part of this effort to celebrate Jason and his book and his ideas. I also had to review back into my emails to try and remember when exactly did I meet Jason and under what context was it? And so it was in mid 2021, I think May, it was June of 2021. I received an email from Jennifer Richmond saying, you could read this. And at the time, Jason was putting forward what he was referring to as humanity-centered SEL, right? So that social emotional learning that Deanna was talking about. And um, as a licensed clinical social worker, I was very aware of social emotional learning and of the positive application of what increasing emotional intelligence, right, in children so that they would become more resilient as adolescents and adults. It was like, that's wonderful. Let's do that. Let's get that in the schools. But as Deanna mentioned, Jason Littlefield was a teacher in a school district focused on teaching SEL, and that when that shift happened, I believe it was in the summer of 2020 when it became the transformative style. He started to work on this humanity-centered SEL. And we connected right away because I was like, okay, we're talking about the same things using slightly different language, right? Because as a licensed clinical social worker, I would have been using more clinical language, and as an educator, Jason was using, the language that fit that context. But we were focused on being pro-human, right? Looking at things from that pro-human element. Also, very much, I'm as interested as he was in his writing at the time on agency, right? Individuals having agency, having the ability to advocate for themselves, right? And to be at the front of their own lives. And then overall just well-being, all the types of well-being. It's, you know, it's been my job for the last 5 years, directly and somewhat indirectly, I'd say, for going back many, many years, that my work is focused on well-being in that holistic sense, mental, emotional, physical, social, spiritual, financial, right? All the different ways that well-being impacts our lives. And when we're out of order in any of those one categories, it throws our well-being off. All of them, we could just be financially unwell, and that disrupts our sleep, and then that disruption of sleep disrupts our body, and then that disrupts our mood, and then that, right, it just goes on, and that disrupts our relationships, right? It's just a little thread you can pull. And so when Jason started moving into the empowered humanity theory, it was just a sort of a broadening and a tightening and a, I don't know what else to call it, but it was this really beautiful evolution of the humanity centered SEL, kind of moving me out of maybe the educational setting and into the broader community. And I had the honor and privilege to be able to record more than one video with Jason talking about humanity-centered SEL and then empowered humanity theory. One, maybe two of those opportunities were with Eric Smith, who you both know, and from Free Black Thought, which Jason is involved in, and then Institute for Liberal Values, which we're all involved in. I serve as an original board member of Institute for Liberal Values, so that's my piece as part of the organization. So, you know, a little bit of background on me, which might be helpful for, you know, for the rest of our time together, since you both shared that, is I was born in the mid 1960s in Los Angeles, California, into a Mexican Roman Catholic family. I'm first generation born in this country in my family, my cousins and I. And I remember hearing stories once I was a little bit older, of course, from my father, who would say in Los Angeles in the 60s, he would encounter signs in windows that would say things like, no dogs or Mexicans allowed, right? So that's the context of, you know, people always assume that racism exists in the South, and that's where it
Mm,
was and it is. And sure, you know, there are racist people who live in the South. There are racist people, people who hold racist ideas all over the country. It just shows up very differently. And so you know, but my father also said to me, right? He didn't leave me with no dogs or Mexicans allowed. He continued in his not direct teachings. He wasn't like that. It was a little bit more to the side. And he would say things to me like, if you walk up to a door and you knock on it and they close it in your face because of who you are, walk away and keep knocking on doors. Don't stand at that door kicking and pounding and screaming and demanding to be let in. It was a very different tactic, right? It wasn't an activist oriented tactic.
mm,
Um, it in some circles it's a bad word now, but my family was focused on assimilation, assimilating into the American culture, so to speak. Right? We're a pluralistic society, but there is this sort of common thread that exists. And yeah, so that's where I started out. I By the time I was a teenager, it was evident to me and everybody else that I was same-sex attracted. So I'm now a trans man, which means I've medically transitioned, I've done hormones and things like that, but I'm female sexed. So my earlier life, up to the age of 39, people would have seen me and made the assumption correctly that I was female, I was a woman, I was a very masculine woman, but clearly a woman. And so in a Mexican Catholic family, that could have been a big problem. Thankfully, it wasn't a big problem. My family was mostly just quiet about it, didn't really talk about it. I was okay with that. I also didn't push it, and I didn't shove it in my family's face. It just seemed unnecessary and disrespectful. And so I would bring girlfriends to the event, but I would just introduce them by their name. We didn't walk around holding hands or making out in front of the family. You know what I mean? Like that just would have been odd. It would have been bad. Like, but none of my cousins did that, right? So that's, that's kind of that's a family I grew up in. That's the context of it. But even then, maybe not until my 20s, not as a teenager, but in my 20s and up to this day, I have also been charged with, so to speak, as you said, Wink, deviating from dogma. I
Mm,
definitely have deviated from dogma most of my life. And it was just my natural way to be. I wasn't intending to be rebellious or a renegade. It was just, no, that doesn't sound right to me. That doesn't feel right to me. That doesn't work for me. So I'm just not going to do that. I didn't necessarily make a big deal out of it. I just went my own way, right? The paths diverged, and I
mhm.
took my road, which had been less traveled, right? So the deviation from the dogma, I'm think things like that are going to come up a lot during our conversations over this podcast and the next three, because I think that's what binds all of us, including Jason, together, is this deviation from the dogma or our heterodoxy or our liberalism, regardless of whether we're conservatives or not. Well, I'm using liberal in that classical way. And so I situate myself right in there with you in that. And so I'm really looking forward to having conversations about the not just the theory of empowered, humanity, but the application, right? As a social worker, I'm very interested in the application of these ideas and how maybe we are applying them personally and occupationally and socially. I would imagine eventually we'll get to talking about things like that. So yeah, thank you so much again for inviting me to be here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of our conversation today.
That was, I mean, I actually learned more about your background, and we've had many conversations, so that was wonderful. I should probably add, because in today's world, when people look at me and want to label me as I'm probably a, white privileged person. But I should give a 2-minute background. I was actually born in the former Soviet Union, in the Ukraine. And my family came really for religious freedom. We were persecuted as Jews. My family was constantly called dirty Jews in Ukraine. And so when I came here, assimilation, when you mentioned assimilation, that was a big part I wanted to be an American, right? And everything that America stood for, which is that individual freedom that my family never experienced in the former Soviet Union. So I never thought of identity as the way kids are being taught to think about it today, which I actually think it's quite disempowering. But for me, it was just being free, saying what I want to say, the classical liberal values that we talk about. That's how I lived. And I never questioned it until about 4 or 5 years ago, to be honest. The first time I really started seeing kind of this hate and division was recent. I mean, I feel pretty naive, to be honest. Like maybe I didn't pay attention as much, but it really, for me, it wasn't until the pandemic that kind of I started opening my eyes as to how things are being framed and this overemphasis on how do we define ourselves? I'm like, and how it's being presented to, and in this case, children, because for me, my eyes got open with schools, is in this very binary way. And humans are so complex, but yet kids are being told to just look at things in either this oppressor or oppressed view. And I guess that's where the dogma comes in, right? So I don't know if we just went a little bit off tangent, but what I wanted to get back to is Jason starts off the work with, some personal stories, struggles. And I think how he found empowered humanity theory is a way to reconcile some of these struggles, to find his resilience. And for me, that's how I see like growing, like you look at the world not with, oh, how is the world against me, but more of what can I do to empower, get better, to overcome whatever the challenge that the world is, telling me right now I'm being challenged, but not that this world is out against me. Whereas unfortunately, I think the kids today are being taught like the system is against you, and so you have to fight the system, not what is your personal agency to overcome whatever the challenge in the moment may be, if that makes any sense.
Mhm.
Um, so should we dive in and talk about some of the um, kind of initial concepts? And I picked a few. I don't know if you guys ran on page let's see here. The Two Wolves. Do you guys remember reading about the two wolves? The ancient Cherokee story of two wolves
What page is that?
illustrates 21.
Oh, thanks.
Um, the internal battle between our primal and evolved instincts. I guess that's what I was trying to get at is our primal instincts is to react, right? Is to, and our evolved instincts are where that thinking brain comes in. So maybe I can start by just explaining what flipping the lid and the different parts of the brain. Okay, I'll start there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's
Um,
good.
so I always like, and this is how I start my conversations, by the way, with my patients, because I'm trying to explain how the nervous system is regulated, and these are like, medical jargony words. So I always say, let's go back in time into like our caveman days when we're living, and what has to be primed for survival when that, tiger can pounce and eat us at any moment, right? So, our sympathetic nervous system, our survival instinct is to either you fight the tiger, run away, flee from the tiger, or freeze, play dead from the tiger and pray it doesn't, eat you. So fight, flee, and freeze. Those are our primitive reflexes. But fast forward thousands and thousands of years, we don't have the same tiger running, pouncing on us, yet we're primed to look for threat. And we're primed to react to things that we may or may not find threatening, right? So that our amygdala, which is kind of like my thumb, and this is based on Dan Siegel's work, which Jason does highlight in the book. So that's our primitive brain, but we have evolved this really higher functioning thinking brain, right? So feeling brain, thinking brain, and this is our prefrontal cortex. And when our prefrontal cortex is engaged, we can overcome. Now, that doesn't mean we need to ignore it. Actually, healing and growth happens when we take the signals from our feeling brain and reflect upon them and think about them and help integrate what is the message that these feelings are sending us, but then using our higher evolutionary cortical brain before we react, right? So that we can actually take these signals and then make conscious choices, taking that pause, reflection, and then, um, you know, acting afterwards. But that's where now when we flipped our lid, and that's when I mentioned, after George Floyd, and I say this because that was me. I mean, you're not human if you look at someone pass that way and not have an emotional response, right? I I personally went into limbic hijack myself. And then slowly, 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 I, my thinking brain came across, and then um, I started seeing basically how it's easier to remain reactive, to say the right things, but not necessarily to take the time to process what was happening, right? I don't know if I'm making sense now, but
No,
Mhm.
you are. You
um,
are.
Yeah.
but that's that concept, and I think what EHT is hoping to accomplish is help people understand when their lid is being flipped, so that they can, you know you practice, and in chapters 2, 3, and 4, there's ways where you actually do this practice to bring back that prefrontal cortex and thinking brain.
Hmm. Yeah.
um so but that goes, I was curious what you guys thought of the two wolves, because there is this saying, I don't know if you guys have heard of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and where he says the line, dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human. And so when that story of, this Cherokee tribe with two wolves, I was like, that was the first thing that ran through my mind, is we're both capable of both. It's what we choose, right? We have that personal agency, that choice to, be good or evil, right? It's not that someone is a good person or a bad person. They can choose to act in a certain way that's good or bad, if that makes sense.
And one of the things I see in the public square these days, the public discourse, is many voices don't choose to feed the good wolf or the good impulses. They use a label or a slogan word, for example, Nazi or fascist. And those terms, I think, trigger those primitive impulses. Um, how do we get past that? Because I think for many people of good faith, when they hear a certain word like that, that's their primitive reaction. And they don't take the time to think, well, maybe I'm being manipulated. Maybe someone wants me to flip my lid. But how do you get into that mental place?
So if I'm engaging in someone, I will always say, tell me more, because for me, I'm confused when so like even online, if someone says, I'm like, wait, I don't understand, tell me more. And usually when the person tries to articulate whatever that dogma is, sometimes they just don't engage because they can't.
Mm,
You know what I mean? But at least that tell me more is that inquisitive curiosity mindset. Like, I
right,
want to
right.
learn more where you're coming from. Xander, what do you think?
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the neurological component of this. As a social worker, I'm very aware of this. And so what I do for a living is teach people things like how to manage stress and how to tolerate distress and how to regulate emotions, right? Because we can't we can't create a perfect world where there's no stress and conflict.
Right.
And so the only thing we can do is learn how to manage and navigate and mitigate and resolve and transform, right? We have these variety of things, options that we can take given the situation. And but it coexists. Every single one of us, unless there's some sort of traumatic brain injury or neurological issue, that occurs, we have it reminds me of the, angel on one shoulder, devil on the other, right? That image and the cartoon of that growing up, like that is us. And I read a book years and years ago. I think it was written by a Jesuit priest called The Soul's Code. And it was this story of what's the difference between somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. and Adolf Hitler? They were leaders, they were charismatic, people followed them, they had ideas. One went in a very destructive way, and one went more in a restorative or transformative way. Like, what made the difference, right? It was a similar skill set that they had. And so it's, and also just the instinct that we have, right? The instinct, it's not just a desire or interest or um, good thing to belong. Belonging is instinctual. Right? We're tribal, so to speak, wired as people. And so because of that, there are people who can manipulate with language, in particular, by using certain names, like calling people derogatory names based on their ethnicity or their race or their religion or the sexual orientation or their class, their education, whatever it is, their intellect, right? There are all these terms. I was quite bullied as a young person, and I heard all kinds of terms for being, because I was Mexican or because I was in special education or because whatever it was, right? And so the ability to go, oh, a person is referring to me in a particular way, I'm unhappy with it. How am I gonna, what am I gonna do? Am I gonna react or respond? And Deanna, you said something about taking the time to process. In addition to that, I'd say there's also an issue of capacity,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
People nowadays are struggling with the capacity to process information that's coming in because there is so much stress and strain on their thinking, on their feeling, on their energy. And if we don't have the capacity to think things through and feel things through, then we are going to react versus respond. And the capacity is based on fairly, simple yet complex things like, are you eating enough nutritious food throughout your day? Are you taking in enough fluids during your day? Are you getting enough quality and quantity of sleep each day? And people who are activated, who are in reaction mode, who are either reacting to things that are being said and done around them or to them, or on the flip side, they're in a reaction mode to try and change the world, improve the world, fix the world, the people around them, right? It could be, quote, the good and the bad, the evil and the pure. Doesn't really matter. It's when it's being fueled by that limbic response, that stress response, that I really want to belong. And for some people, belonging means making everybody around them feel comfortable, which is the fourth F, right? You said you flee or you fight or you freeze. There's also fawn, the fawn stress response. Think of the class clown who might be trying to deviate attention from the fact that they're struggling with their studies, or the family entertainer who's cute up there in the living room playing their little drums or lip syncing to Beyonce, but really what they're doing is trying to take the pressure off, the stress in the family, the tension in the family, trying to release that pressure through entertainment, through laughter. Perhaps being an activist is another form of the fawn response to stress, because you're joining people or you're having people join you, you're working towards something, the good or the bad, so to speak. And it's all about bringing people together because you want to belong to something, a group of people, an effort, a movement. So like, that's why I love the bringing in. It's like it's the humanity centered part of it, right? It's like we are individuals and we're part of this thing called humanity, right? If you've ever seen that image, I love the image of, instead of leaves on a tree, they're very multicolored fingerprints on tree branches, right? Humanity is the tree trunk and the branches, and we are those individual fingerprints or leaves on the tree. Those two things exist. So does the devil and the angel, or the primal and the evolved, the limbic response and the higher executive response. We don't want to live in just one or the other. We want both of those things because we don't want to ignore the true danger signals,
That's
right?
right.
We don't want to ignore the saber-toothed tiger, but we don't want to live our lives, right? We don't want to live every day, all day, thinking that, you know, the wolf is going to get us, right?
Yeah.
So it's very complicated, and when we don't have the time or the capacity to really, and that could be for many reasons. People who are having to work three jobs to support their family, they're not going to have the time, maybe not the capacity, right? So we're not just talking about people who are activated. We're just talking about everyday people who just don't have.
Well, there's the, you know, uh, what is the I'm missing the guy's name. Maslow, I think,
Yeah,
hierarchy of needs, right?
that's
Like
Yes,
right.
you have
yes.
to have your basic needs met first, right?
Yes.
Food, hydration, exactly what you said.
Safety, security. Mhm.
Yeah.
Exactly. But then that's the next concept that comes to my mind is, and then it's neurons that fire together, wire together. It's really what we practice. That's what becomes more automatic, right? And I always tell
Hmm.
like my patients, I'm like, the more you practice balance training, the more your balance is going to get stronger. The piano player, the after a while, you can close your eyes, your fingers do the movement, right? So it's what we practice then becomes ingrained with like hardwired, right? Which is why, I am so concerned at what our kids are being taught to practice, starting from kindergarten, that they're being first taught to look at immutable characteristics, right? First see that it's like the opposite of MLK, which is get to know Wink for who Wink is, get to know Xander for, don't see a black man, or you know what I mean? It's it's the opposite of what I thought we have evolved to be a better society. We're almost going backwards. So that's why I feel like this work is so important now because it's teaching what we should be practicing, which is
I
creating
think
that
I think
pause.
I think these realities have always been parallel, but I think social media has exaggerated, right? There was always the parallel movement or movements aside the civil rights movement or the gay rights movement or women's liberation or like there were, just because the civil rights movement occurred and it was successful and the Civil Rights Act passed didn't mean that hearts and minds were just flipped overnight in everybody, right? So it's um the gay rights movement, it worked, it was successful, we got marriage equality, all these different things. That doesn't mean that people still don't have beliefs and feelings about things. But when there are events that happen that bring things up in this bigger way, almost like the mushroom cloud, it's like some events like 9/11 seem to bring a bunch of people together, while at the same time I also remember a lot of tension in communities over issues of, do we or don't we protect our Arab residents from the incoming government intrusion into, questioning them? Are we going to have internment camps set up again? Right. So it's like these things, they almost are like simultaneous. The more, maybe the more prominent civil rights um movement track, right? The MLK, the you know, that's what a lot of people remember. They might not remember, the Nation of Islam crack of that part, that movement, so to speak, or the you know what I mean? Like, so it's kind of the same thing. It's within, the gay rights movement, people are not familiar with, well, what happened to the people who held more radical beliefs, the quote queer rights, activists? Well, they got pushed aside so that we could move forward. But if for anybody who's ever studied or heard about or been taught about the theater of the oppressed, I learned that in the 1990s when I was in college, and that's where the oppressed or oppressor idea comes from, right? The theater of the oppressed, which I think comes, I forget his name, but I think it's a South American gentleman, where you're like, here are all the ways you're privileged and all the ways that you're not privileged, and who lines up. And it's not just you're all this or all this. We're kind of crisscross, but it's people present it in you're this or this. They don't talk about the crisscross between, well, I hold some privileges or what I would refer to as advantages and some, oppressions or disadvantages, that's really what's real life. And I think things just get magnified a little bit more now. I don't even think it's just the internet. I think cable TV did that with the OJ Simpson trial. Like everything started to, we got all the details of everything, instead of just the sound bites of things.
I would like to
I
add
mean,
to what Sanders
yeah.
said about real life and how real life is more nuanced and complex than just oppressor oppressed binary, because it is. Um, I was reaching back to get a copy of my book, Letters in Black and White, where I really shared, as I saw it, many of the realities about the human condition, not just the Black American condition, but the human condition that people oftentimes overlook in a time of conformity and dogma and slogan words. Here's a paragraph that I thought was kind of central to the love I have for the human dignity and for the individual, that we're more than just race or skin color. And if I can have your indulgence, Diana and Sandra, I'll read this paragraph. It's on page 51 of my book. Unlike writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, I have been called the N word due to racial prejudice in public school. First time was at E.S.H. Green Elementary School, a formerly all white school in which I found myself as the only Black student in my third grade. And this would have been the fall of 1969, ladies and gentlemen, in Chesterfield County, Virginia. Abusive white classmates there repeatedly called me the N word. One day, I just simply sat down on the playground and thought about why these classmates were abusing me so. I knew from growing up on Twyman Road that there was no correlation between intelligence and skin color. The most important adults in my life, mom and dad, grandma, Uncle Robert Daniel Twyman, Aunt Juanita Twyman, Uncle William Womack, oh, they were all Black, and they came in a range of colors. And it dawned on me that my classmates were dumb. They were not smart. And since I prized intelligence as a young kid most highly, I concluded I would ignore and dismiss these tormentors. This realization armed me well for life ahead in the 1970s. And what that shows you is that you can, quote unquote, be the subject of prejudice and bigotry at a young, tender age. But you also, as a matter of human dignity and humanity, have the ability to decide how you will respond to what the outside world throws at you. And to me, that experience was so central to me because if I had absorbed and adopted external locus of control as a life philosophy, well, that would have been in of me. But I did the opposite. I looked inside. And I wish more people would recognize, and I think Jason does in his framework, that the most powerful thing we can do is what we bring to the table of life from what's inside of us. And that's all I'm going to say.
I
No,
think
no,
the
it's
original SEL was teaching children exactly what you just, demonstrated through what you read. I had
Mhm.
the same thing. It's like the slur words, and I would go home and say, the kids are calling me this, this, and this. And my father would say, pay them no mind. I was a bit more outspoken, so sometimes I would correct them. Uh, I remember the more popular, I can say it because it's not as charged as the N word. One of the more popular terms back in the 1970s that I would hear would be wetback,
Mhm.
right? And so, and I would say, oh no, my grandma didn't swim here. She drove over in her car.
I like that.
Right? It's like because that was the idea. It was referring to the Cubans who
Right,
swam, you
right.
know, from Cuba to or which of course nobody swam. They were on a boat for God's sake, or the people who would swim across the Rio Grande River,
Yeah,
whatever. And then they would look at me like, "Wait, what?" Right? Which is similar to, well, what would happen, if well, you're a Nazi. It's like, well, I mean, let's break it down. Okay, so I'm not this, like, I don't understand, where you're
right,
getting,
right, right.
so there's like ignore it, there's challenge it, and then there's I don't think you understand what you're saying. Let
Yeah,
me,
yeah. And this is so fascinating to me, how our environment kind of colors our perception of people and groups and individuals. So, for example, thank you for sharing that story, Stander. You might be curious, as a kid who grew up in a southern suburb in the 1970s, what was my first impression of Hispanic Americans, you might ask? Well, it's kind of interesting, I think, and I'll share it. So, in my school, my junior high and high school, there was only one person who was Hispanic American. I remember her name well. Shout out to my former classmate, Valerie Garcia. And I remember learning about civil rights in history class and ethnic groups in my ethnic groups class. And it occurred to me, what Valerie's story is, her life story, because we were reading about, groups in general. So one day I asked Valerie in history class, Valerie, tell me about your family. And she said, well, I'm not Mexican American. Let's get that straight. I'm Spanish American. My family has been in New Mexico since the 1700s. It's like, oh, okay. And so the next person I ever met who was Hispanic was Professor Gerald Torres, a law professor at Harvard Law School. So when I entered adulthood, Vander, my perception of Hispanic Americans were that they were aristocrats. They were like these
mm,
people from the 1700s, or they were law professors at Harvard Law School, which to me is kind of interesting. I would never have had that perception that you encountered in terms of the wetback thing. It would have been totally opposite, which is kind of
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, absolutely. There's difference between, being in California,
Right,
Southern California, very close to the Mexican border versus,
right.
yeah,
Virginia.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
So the query, I'm going to ask a question. Query, which perception is better in terms of the humanity of someone? To have the perception that all Hispanics are aristocrats, or all Hispanics are wetbacks, or something in between? What's your thought about that?
Yeah, I'd say something in between because if we're all aristocrats, then there'd be no need necessarily to ensure that we are getting equal
Hmm.
access. There was a time when, Hispanics couldn't serve in the US military, right?
Hmm.
I think it was PBS did a whole series on that,
Right,
just
right.
like other groups that they've done. And so that would have been an issue. My family is also Spanish, but went to Mexico and were there for a few generations before then my
Okay.
grandmother came up to the United States. And
Right, right.
that's a very different well, as the kids would say, lived experience, right? That's a very different life
Right,
trajectory
right.
than if my family were indigenous mestizos, native to what we would now call Mexico,
Hmm.
or Puerto Rico,
Hmm.
or down in El Salvador, right?
Hmm.
Hispanic is this huge category that Spanish speaking, peoples who have come from Spanish speaking
Sure,
origins.
sure.
Yeah,
See,
so
Diana,
yeah.
this is the beauty of Jason's framework. I mean, this back and forth between Xander and I is so precious because I'm learning more, he's learning more, and we are in a sense becoming more human, if you will, because we're
100%.
we're rooted in the richness of the human experience. I love this.
You
This
know,
is
and
good.
as you guys are talking, I
Mm.
was actually reflecting a little bit about my own childhood because, when we emigrated, the whole point was in the 80s. I don't, you probably are not that familiar, but there was a huge movement to save the Soviet Jews. A lot of us were stuck in the Soviet Union after the Holocaust because, it was either the fascists, from Germany on
Right,
one
right.
side or the communists. So yes, we survived because we weren't killed by Hitler, but we then became under communist rule. And my grandfather was Romanian. Anyway, the reason I'm saying this is the whole when we came to America, suddenly these people from Georgia, from Uzbekistan, from Armenia, from like all these like you would think try were just Jewish immigrants in America, and we found our even though we came from different languages and everything, we were able to somehow, appreciate the struggle that we had together,
Together,
even
right,
though we completely came from different backgrounds. And that was the humanity, is that we,
right.
relied on each other. And that's what's missing today. That's not It's not
Mm.
multicultural education that our kids are being taught
It's
today.
the opposite.
It's the opposite. And that's why it's so, frightening, because we are tribal. Like if you go back to that primitive
Right.
brain, survival is tribal. So,
Survival is travel. There's
Well,
our
and
slogan word of the
yeah, and which means that, you know, we'd be a member of our tribe and there'd be other tribes and we'd get along with some and we wouldn't get along with others. Um, you know, that's just the indigenous people's reality throughout history. It wasn't as if there was a bunch of kumbaya campfires happening all across what is North America now, of indigenous, or as they would say in Canada, First Nations people. Like they warred against each other. And so that doesn't mean, right? I like to say to people, in a pluralistic society, we're going to have our own enclaves, whether that's social clubs, places of worship, restaurants, neighborhoods, right? We're going to have our enclaves, and we're also going to have spaces where we're all together. And the responsibility to coexist in these public spaces means that the maybe the language we use in the enclave, the values and beliefs that we hold those around us in our enclave to, when we go into those public spaces, into the public market, into the, whatever they are, we we hold them, they're in us, but we cannot infringe on the other people in that public space who come from their own enclaves, right? The ideal is to tolerate, so to speak, so that you can do what you're doing over in your enclave with your culture or your place of worship. You can have your values and beliefs, but you're not going to impose those on me, and you're not going to turn the laws against me because they don't align with you and maybe where you've come from. Right. And so that's why I think this idea of assimilation works so wonderfully, because it's I like that we moved away from the, what was that old concept people used to use? Melting pot. I like that we kind of moved away from melting pot and more into, like, I don't know, tossed salad or stew, because everything then retains its own unique shape and color and somewhat taste. Not in the stew version, maybe. I like that better, and it works. And the only way to make it work is if we value each person as a human being, that we recognize that each person has their own agency, and that um, people's well-being matters, and they don't need to be imposed upon, right? That will actually that could be a detriment to their well-being. And
Sa-
so,
Sandra,
yeah.
sometimes I'm just going to ask out of curiosity, one of Jason's points, but sometimes I have found, at least in the Black American experience, that those who go against tribal instincts and tribal solidarity are seen as quote unquote acting white or not
Mhm.
authentically Black. Um, and I do not respect dogmas, so don't worry about remaining in your lane. I don't do dogma. Thoughts about those I don't
Mhm.
want to use the word slur, that's too harsh a word, but about those
Yeah.
labels attributed to some Black Americans, and I'm thinking of John McWhorter, Lynn Lowry, blah, 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 who do resist the tribal idea of solidarity. What's your thought about that?
Hmm. Well, well, first I would say I think they just are posing an alternative solidarity
Mhm.
versus, yeah, but which I think would be similar to what I've experienced, which is, yeah, I mean, I'm clearly a bad tranny because I don't go along with the dogma of what is espoused as, but is not actually the um, prominent or dominant or majority collective view from the transgender community
And people
on.
feel free to express their dissatisfaction that you're deviating from tribal dogma.
Oh, of course, of
Eh,
course. Because because it's intentional. It's a verbal get back in your cell, right? It's a toe the line. It's right. I mean, you didn't say it, but I thought you were going to use like a milder slur, like the title of the book label that people
yeah, yeah, yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
to.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I was trying to be
Um,
delicate, gentleman.
yeah, I know, right? So me too, but it's so it's one of those things where it they're brief little attempts to say, get back, get back in line, right?
Get
And we're
back
brought
in
up, a lot of
line.
us are brought up as kids. You
Hmm.
form a single line
Hmm.
and you march in unison. And
Right,
so they're like, get back in
right,
line. That's the wrong view. That's the wrong opinion. That's the wrong term.
right.
It comes up around, I'd say some of the like a flashpoint for me as far as getting on the radar of the people who are dissatisfied was when I made a comment publicly during a live feed about pronouns. And this would have been in maybe 2023. And it was,
The
people
hot
were really
times.
gunning, yeah, for the
Right, right,
pronoun,
right.
for the institutionalization of the pronoun, right? You will put it in your Zoom, window. You will put it in your email signature. You
You
will be
will.
fined if you don't use it, right? It
Force
was like
and
this,
compliance.
yeah, which is not how pluralism works.
No, not at
And
all.
so I would say things like, well, people would say, what are your pronouns? And I would say, I'd prefer not to be asked that question. But since you've asked it of me, my response is that, you know, either say what you see or, well, I'm a trans man and I spent all of this effort to transition. And so it kind of bums me out that you don't just see me as, a man. I'm a trans kind of man. I know I'm female, but you know what I mean? Just socially in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, what was the point of all this if you're now going to be like, I'm not exactly sure who, what or who you are? I'm like, oh, really? Come on. Do we have to go through this? But that got me into a lot of trouble. And then with the neo pronouns, people using, adjectives and inanimate objects and pieces of food, and celestial referencing as their pronouns. And unfortunately, people who have actively utilized the pronoun it and itself to refer to themselves. And I said publicly, I find using the it as a pronoun dehumanizing, and I will not refer to a human being in that way. And for some reason, that really upset people in my community, some, not everybody, few people in my community and within my profession, within social work. There was
No,
actually a chapter of the National Association of Social Workers, one of the state chapters, put out a public statement on Facebook denouncing me and the harm I had committed against my community because I said I would not use that pronoun.
you're emphasizing humanity. You're
Yeah,
emphasizing,
but I'm
it's,
denying that individual person who calls themselves it. And I'm like, but they're dehumanizing themselves. And now you're
yeah,
saying I'm dehumanizing them,
yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, that's a great point. That's a great point. Do we become quote unquote complicit if we go along in the dehumanization of other humans? And that's
Yeah.
a good point. Yeah.
Or people would say, am I lying, right? Around the gender stuff. If I went out into the world and insisted, or even just here right now, if I insisted that you all accept me as male, people would say, well, you're lying. You're not male, you're female. Whereas I say, I know I'm female. I'm, I'm not dumb. Like I'm a transsexual. Transsexuals, we all know we're that's what we're doing. We know what we're doing. It's there's different members of the trans community that use different ways of describing
Sure.
themselves.
Sure.
And so they would insist on their maleness or femaleness, which was not their biological or natal or
Mm,
chromosomal or all the other different ways we can look at this. And so, and even experiential for the most part, except for these kids. I mean, it's a very different world with these kids now, because their
right. Right.
experiential sex socialization doesn't actually match with their birth or natal or biological sex. So that you can't speak to that, and that's going to be a different reality that we're going to have to deal with eventually. So yeah, there is pushback, and usually it's kind of subtle, but sometimes it can be really over the top. People calling up and saying, or emailing and saying, you've invited this person to speak at your event. Um, you need to undo that, or we're going to create a bunch of chaos for you. And that some people have been successful with that with me, but most have not. But a couple of times I have been removed from a panel or taken off of the main speaker list for an event. So
So
yeah,
sad. So sad.
yeah,
So counter to these values that Jason is talking about. I mean, how do you promote curiosity if you deplatform people of good faith, right?
yeah,
How do you center values of the individual if you're not letting people be true to whatever their creative expression is? I mean, to me, it's I don't know, it seems like a way towards a dark future, a very dark future where people feel constrained, operate within certain permissible guardrails. And if they don't,
yeah,
and they're kind of, I mean, it reminds me of the Soviet Union, Diana. I often think about the Soviet Union, how there were things you could say and there were things you couldn't say. There were people who wrote to the applause of the seals in Moscow, the Kremlin. And then there were brave people like Boris Pasternak, who never received the acclaim they should have in their native land. I'm always struck by the courage of that writer, that poet, Boris Pasternak. He was Jewish as well. Um,
He's somehow related to me. Don't ask me how, but like
oh,
some
now I
distant
really like you.
cousin of cousins.
Now you're really on my radar screen.
I mean, literally, like we're
Right, right.
talking about seven,
Question for you,
so
removed.
Diana. You had mentioned coming to the U.S., immigrating from Ukraine, and developing affinity with other people from other countries that had been part of the Soviet bloc. Did you find there were cultural differences and distinctions between Jewish immigrants from the Soviet Union and Jewish Americans who had been here since, say, the 1800s or the early
Oh my
1900s?
God.
Talk to
I
me.
mean,
Tell me about it
this is the biggest issue right now.
right
Um,
now.
right now. Um, I look at my Jewish American co-members of my tribe, shall we say,
Yeah.
and I don't recognize who they are. Many of them have embraced the oppressor oppressed narrative. They don't see anything wrong with it as long as they're considered in the oppressed bucket as Jews.
Craziness. Don't they
And I
remember
think
what
it's
happened in the Soviet Union? Don't they
well,
like
they don't.
because
They
they weren't
don't.
there?
Many of them have grown up here, and they
Hmm.
have been. This is what I mean about emotions being manipulated. They have
Right.
internalized I mean, our history, as you know, is not wonderful in the sense that we do have or did have a reckoning, but I would argue that speaks to the amazing foundation of this country, which we do strive to be a better, entity. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean we're perfect. We're not, nobody is ever
Yeah.
perfect, no country,
Sure.
but that's what we strive to. And yet that is somehow forgotten, or dismissed. And this is where if you don't process things like shame and guilt, instead of then, processing those emotions and then making conscious choices to make sure you're not discriminating against someone, you flip the lid and you just or flip the script and it's reverse discrimination because now the oppressed is oppressor, but you just flip the script. That work so like 30 years from now it's going to be the white people saying like, well, look what you guys did. I mean, it makes zero sense. And yet I'm looking at my Jewish American, and not everybody, but certainly where
Right.
I am in Silicon Valley, the majority of Jewish Americans here, they don't get it. They don't understand why what the kids are being taught is so egregious. In
Wow.
fact, many of them
Wow.
are on school boards, and I'm fighting them. So it's a big problem. And the ones that are speaking up are a lot of the Soviet Jews, and not just the Soviet Jews, the Persian Jews, the Lebanese Jews, the Jews who have come from
David
oppressive.
Bernstein, for example.
Exactly, exactly. So a lot of us who, and none of us, I believe, were activists. Like I would rather just spend my days taking care of my kids and my patients and not do any of
Right.
this stuff.
Right.
But I feel like it has to be said. Like
You're
we have
summoned by the times. You're summoned by history, in a sense.
that's right. That's right. And the whole time, like I wrote another quote for myself as I was reading this first chapter. I'm like, really, what resonates with what Jason is trying to do here is to create that pause. And I think about Viktor Frankl, right? And
Yes.
his
Man's
fame.
search for meaning.
That's
I had
right.
it right
And
there.
that's right. And the famous quote being, between stimulus and response, there's that space. That's right.
Yeah.
Um, in that space is where our power is. We can choose what our response is, right? And I
Yes.
don't think our kids are actually being taught that they have a choice because they're actually being taught a form of learned helplessness where you're in
Hmm.
this bucket or that bucket and that's just the way it is. And it's like, where's the
Yeah.
personal agency that's being stripped of them?
Yeah.
How is that healthy for the developing brain? How do
Some
Well,
you
of
and
it's
it's
said
a
it's
scaffolding, right? Because
yeah.
their little developing brain doesn't yet have access to the executive functioning part of the brain that's going to be very helpful. But there's scaffolding that can be built that can get them closer and closer towards like a children's version of those things that are going to come later. That I there are some schools, I don't know if they still do it, but I remember there were schools where they would teach mindfulness and they would have, that would be something they would do. They would spend a certain time of their day, you know,
well,
doing
that's
like a walking or seated mindfulness activity.
Well, no, I remember my daughter in elementary school, this is before 2020, would come and be like, I'm doing the shark fin. And she's grounding herself, right? And I'm
Mhm.
like, oh my God, I love that the school is teaching you this, right? And in fact, so when my eyes were open 2020, and I went to my daughter's school district and I'm like, "Well, I don't understand what you guys are doing here. Like, this is the opposite of, what should be done." And they're like, "No, no, no, this is our equity agenda." Like, this was, and basically they were trying to explain to me that they are fixing the problems that exist because of these, disparities in outcomes. So I spent
Mhm.
the next 2 years in 21, 22, up and almost 23. Um, volunteering in the classroom in one of the East Menlo Park, so the under served, marginalized communities, teaching science in the classroom. And first of all, I didn't understand how the changes they were doing at the high school level were, helping these kids in the elementary school level. And which, by the way, after my spending the 2 years, they weren't. They're actually just reproducing the same problems. But these are like amazingly bright kids that are basically getting disempowered to even try. And I did one lesson where I actually taught them this is what happens when you guys have big emotions. And this
Right.
girl who, up until that point, was just, there's a lot, you can tell there's a lot of emotional stuff happening. She can't concentrate. She's like, she came to me, she gave me this big hug. She's like, "Are you saying my big feelings are okay?" Like, I'm like, of course they're okay. The question is, how do you learn how to control them so that they're not getting in the way of your relationships, your ability to learn, but it was like there was no pause to let her say, "Okay, yes, it's okay to not feel happy or not feel what, but let's in the moment take a moment and show you that you have control over what you can be okay with." It it
Yeah.
it um
Yeah.
it was just for me an a opening to we're doubling down on what has been wrong with this
Mhm.
approach. So yeah,
Mm, mm,
I guess my question, and I'm looking at the time, we should probably also wrap up. In light of um, the events that happened in the last couple of weeks with the murder of Charlie Kirk, and then the response that I think before we started recording this, what we briefly talked about is, um, are we past? I guess that's the question I want to um,
mm.
leave for the audience to think about before we delve into chapters 2 through or parts 2 through 4. Are we past the ability for this work to make a difference, or is this work exactly what is needed for this moment?
Mm.
And we should really be embracing it full force. Like, because I personally struggled for a little while, and I have my own opinions of where I've landed on it. But 2 weeks ago, I was really questioning whether this work would even, are we that we're past it, that we're just, our society is farther gone than I thought. I was in a pretty low
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
So I'm curious where you guys are.
Notice how your feelings are being informed by your primitive brain. It's being informed by what you see in social media. Am I right? So you're seeing the extremes. We have a country of 350 million people. It's very sad that one man was politically assassinated for his views and opinions, but one should also recognize that he would have supported the sort of support for free speech and creative expression that Mason does in his framework. And number two, it's very easy to engage in catastrophic thinking that that one really needs to keep in mind. As Sanders said earlier at the beginning of our talk, most normies are not caught up in the ups and downs of wars on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. And I think because that's true, there is hope for the framework. For long term, not short term.
Yeah. I think it is um, exactly what is needed, right? I think there are many complementary efforts that are out there right now that people are, putting effort into. And I'm like, let's find a way to work together, right? let's get Institute for Liberal Values, working with Braver Angels, working with the Pro Human Foundation, working with let's work together, because the majority of people are uncertain how to, make sense of all of this, if they're even aware and paying attention to what's going on, and would like to, live in a country and in a world where people aren't being, gunned down for their views, for their opinions. And the way to do that, I think, is to bring these ideas that exist all over the interwebs. There, people are talking about them on podcasts. But they're not going to necessarily show up in the algorithms are not going to show them to everybody. So we have to figure out a way to come together. The more of us that come together as organizations, and then all of the people associated with those organizations who can then put messages out, right? It reminds me of the old phone tree activation. We need to activate the 21st century version of the phone tree to get everybody to, the meeting, or the, whatever it is that we used to, call people for. And so I'm looking forward to more and more people learning about the empowered humanity theory, and reading Jason's book. And I'm really looking forward also to talking later on throughout our series of some of the applications and ways that people can get involved in being part of, the work that we're doing, and how to apply it in their life, in their community, in their schools.
That's a perfect place to end, I think. I'm
Yes.
looking forward to our next conversation.
Me too.
Me too, definitely.
Yep. Until then.
Until then.
Until then.